Bam.
Hi, this is Nick Ragone, and you are watching the Break It Down show. We're going to have a good time tonight.
Yes, we are. Yes, we are. Thanks, Ben, so much for coming on the show. There's so many different things in life that we get to do in this modern time that I think would blow our grandfathers and great grandfathers away. You talk often about the World War II era on your show, and we'll plug that here in a second. But I just wanted to say thanks for coming on. Really looking forward to talking to you.
There's
I read
nothing
your
else going
book.
on today, so I figured everybody's watching us. There's really nothing going on in the world.
It's true. It's true. That's kind of how I run my life. The most, and I think this goes right back into the greatest generation. The most important person in my life, the most impactful person is me. Is me and the people around me, and that to me is where my effort, my focus ought to be. And I think that goes back to the greatest generation and the challenges that those folks had. They couldn't get too big. They had to this is what I'm going to do. It's my duty to go do this thing or whatever it is.
Yeah, what's amazing, my brother and I started this channel about a year and a half ago, in part because we thought that there was an opportunity to tell the stories of the greatest generation heroes in a more intimate and sustainable way. Like every day we put out a short or every week a video talking about the people that we know about, the Audie Murphys and the Dwight Eisenhowers and the John Bassilones and people that you know from World War II. But then so many stories of people you never heard of, whether it was a nurse or a soldier, a Marine, a mom on the home front that did something extraordinary. But that's really, the greatest generation to me is special for two reasons. One is, they're dying off. There's fewer and fewer with us every day. And when they go, I think of a piece of America, our DNA goes with them because they were such a special cohort in the existence of this country. And the second part is, and a lot of the themes of our videos that my brother and I do, is that the greatest generation, they didn't ask to save the world. They were called upon to save the world. If you remember, America was a pretty isolationist country all throughout the 1930s, even into the early 1940s. And we mostly wanted to mind our own business. But the war came to us. And when the greatest generation was asked to step up, they did it selflessly. They did it without fail, without bravado, and without complaining. And they did it heroically. And I think there was something like, I think, 15 million Americans involved in World War II, some way or another. And each one of them, I promise you, each one of them has a story, and it's an intimate story. It's an amazing story. It's a selfless story. It's a heroic story. And our goal, really, my brother and I, is to over the next years tell those stories.
Yeah. Yeah, it's neat. I got a chance to meet a guy. He's passed away now, but his name was Chet Roan. No one's ever going to have heard of this guy. He's from Texas, and he didn't go to D-Day. He arrived after that, and the second he got to the continent, they threw him in the back of a half track, and he hustled his ass straight to the Battle of the Bulge. We'll get you all your gears and your canteens. And so he's like, I was freezing to death out there, and just as cold, putting on whatever kind of clothes they could find along the way to try to stay warm. It turns out half tracks, not very warm. Mm-hmm. and so he has this amazing story. And and look, he was at a point in his life where he was still all with it, but he sort of talked in circles, right. And so we had to do a very gentle editing to this, to respect him, respect the story. And his unit, liberated concentration camps, and he had all these incredible stories. But again, this is some guy in the back of a pickup truck for all intents.
Right, and seemingly an ordinary story, but I could tell you they were pretty extraordinary. And my brother and I, we've done probably 500 videos in the last 18 months, and a lot of our stuff comes from oral histories that soldiers give. Some of it comes from archives. Some of it comes from just digging through the internet and finding these amazing stories. And each one of them is pretty poignant. They're pretty moving. They're connected not just to the events of that time, but then when they come back home and they reconnect with their spouse and they have families and they go on to quietly live lives of being good community citizens and giving back and doing great things here on the home front. And we really feel like there's something special about that generation because when they came back, they didn't talk about what they did. You probably know this. You've heard this, I'm sure. But like these guys, they suffered in silence. A lot of them had PTSD. A lot of them, never spoke about their heroism. I'll tell you a funny story. we did a
Mm.
couple of videos on Russell Johnson, the professor from Gilligan's Island, which everybody
Yeah.
remembers the professor from Gilligan's Island. And he actually flew 44 combat missions in the Pacific. He earned a Purple Heart. He had a ditch in the ocean. A true World War II hero. His co-star Dawn Wells, Marianne. He and Dawn were very good friends for 50 years. And she didn't learn about his World War II heroism. She didn't learn that he even served in the war until at his funeral when one of his men eulogized him. And she turned around and said to somebody like, I've known this guy for 50 years. We worked together. I had no idea he even served in the war. I mean,
Yeah.
that tells you that's pretty extraordinary. The guy flew 44 missions. He had a Purple Heart. He had a ditch over the ocean. He survived. He doggy paddled in the water for 12 hours with 2 broken ankles. I mean, this is a legit war hero, and she
Yeah.
never knew.
Yeah. Yeah. It's very, very true. You hear these tales over and over again. You'll appreciate this one. So the last surviving sailor from the USS Indianapolis getting sunk off of Tinian is a guy named Harold Brace from my hometown, very small little hometown. And he's still with us, had him on the show. And he said out loud with his out loud voice, he's like, yeah. And so, after the sinking, me and the other guys that had survived, we all got to go back. And the Navy said, where do you want to go? And, they all picked their spots. And then he's like, never told my folks about what happened.
Wow.
Never told his folks.
That's amazing, isn't it? That's mind-numbing.
Yeah. It's not everybody knows what the USS Indianapolis is, but everybody has seen Jaws. Everybody remembers that thing.
That great
He was
speech.
one of them dudes.
The great speech about the Indianapolis with the sharks circling around. And one of the most harrowing, the Indianapolis sinking. I mean, there's a lot of incidents like that from World War II that are so harrowing. It's amazing to think what these guys went through, particularly in the Pacific Theater, which was much more brutal. I mean, they were both brutal, but some of the stories that we've uncovered, even miracles. We tell one of the stories. I don't know if you ever heard of Robert Hillman. He was a parachuter in the 82nd Airborne from Connecticut, and he was 19 or 20 years old. He was preparing for D-Day. He was getting ready. He was one of the 82nd that went in early, and as he was fiddling with his gear just before getting on the plane, they packed their own chutes. He looked at his parachute, and he noticed that it was from the Pioneer Parachute Company in Connecticut, which was a mile from his house. And he kind of was telling the guys next to him, like, oh my God, this parachute is made down the street from me. I used to bike past it every day going to school. And then he looked a little further and he flipped it over and he saw his mother's initials on the parachute. And she worked there. And he goes, oh my God, you're not going to believe this. I know my chute's going to work. My mother inspected this parachute. And it's in that video, we did that video, it got like 3 million views. And it's just one of those stories. And there's so many of them from World War II, these kind of moments of faith, these miracles that just happened.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. My grandfather, look at all these letters. My grandfather
amazing.
Went through flight school and wrote to ultimately his wife. And I've learned a lot about my grandfather. His name's Don Norton. He passed away about 25 years ago now. But he was a poor kid from a family. And what we often lose track of is just how hard it was to even stay alive back then. He's born in 22. And so there's no antibiotics, and things that would be outpatient surgery, were lethal back then. So it was a family of 6 boys, but only 3 make it to adulthood. 2 of them die like right at 18 years old, and basically the same thing, appendicitis, and one of them dies as a baby. And death was so normal. Everybody kind of just goes, oh, that one died early. We don't even count that one. Only 5 boys. Like, no, that's an actual human that came out of another human's body, and it didn't get past 18 months. It didn't get past,
the fragility of life was much greater back then, especially if you grew up during the Depression, and it was a completely different era. And like I said, what attracted us to telling these stories is that so many of them are now leaving us, and there's every day the numbers dwindle. And like I said, I think when they leave us completely, a piece of America leaves us, and probably a really good piece of America. And B, how many of those stories are will be forgotten to history if they're not told, which is the sad part, because whether you were just an average person who enlisted or got drafted, or you had a mom that went into a factory and was Rosie the Riveter, or you seemingly had an insignificant job as a infantryman or on a ship. Nothing was insignificant. Nothing uh, was
Yeah.
forgotten. And I think so many Americans today have lost memory of that generation and of just the insane amount of sacrifice they went through, came back, built lives of their own, never talked about it, never bragged about it, never preened about it, and just kind of moved on. And I think it's incumbent on all of us to kind of try to keep that memory alive.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. There are so many of these stories, and I'm a firm believer that, as you know, I talk about my grandfather not all the time, but often enough on the show, especially, and I'll put pictures up, stuff like that, because this is a way of maintaining his being alive. And if I don't do it, literally nobody else will, right? And so when I'm in the archives and I'm reading old things from the family, or I'm looking at the newspaper database or whatever it is, and I find little nuggets of their lives, that's it. That's the last time someone's going to look at that piece of the
Yeah.
newspaper and read that story, because they're never going to look for that again unless you do it. And I'm going to get this back to you in a second. But I love telling this thing. Billy the Kid was dead and forgotten. It took some news reporter to find some guy that happened to remember about some guy named Billy the Kid to bring him back to life. And now, if you say the Old West, who's the most famous person? You are for sure going to think of the name Billy the Kid if it's not the first name you think of. So here was someone who was dead and gone, but then came back and is prominent in that entire history now.
Yeah, that's a good one. I feel a little bit like John Basilone. John Basilone was, after Chesty Puller, maybe the most decorated, greatest Marine of all time. He was in the HBO series The Pacific, so he wasn't totally lost to history. But when John Basilone, so the quick story on John Basilone, I'm sure a lot of people know it, some have forgotten it. It was he won the he earned the Medal of Honor at Guadalcanal in one of the most ferocious battles in history. Single-handedly held off thousands of Japanese over 3 nights with basically a Browning automatic and a machete. He comes back to the U.S. Back then when you received the Medal of Honor, they put you on bond tours to raise money. You became a celebrity. He traveled around with movie stars, raised money. He told the Marines, I want to go back to the Pacific. They said, absolutely not. He kept begging the Marine Corps brass. Finally, they relented and said, okay, we're going to send you back to Iwo Jima. He was among the first wave to hit the beaches of Iwo. Basically saved a bunch of men, and then got killed, earned a Navy Cross for it. But he went back after winning the Medal of Honor, earning the Medal of Honor, got the Navy Cross at Guadalcanal. He was as famous as Joe DiMaggio or Sinatra in the 40s. I mean, John Basilone was a household name. And over time, 50 years later now, very few people remember who John Basilone was. If you're from Raritan, New Jersey, there's still a Basilone parade. Or if you're a Marine, you know who John Basilone is because every Marine camp has a Basilone Highway or Basilone Road. But most Americans couldn't name who John Basilone was. And at one point, he was, a household name
Yeah,
for his heroism. And there's so many John Basilones who these guys are getting forgotten to history, and they shouldn't be forgotten.
yeah, yeah. I live in California. If I drive anywhere south of here, I'm going to be at Camp Pendleton, and I'm going to go on the Basilone Highway, and I'll be right there. So you're right. It is everywhere. And when I see that, I do think about his trajectory, because he had earned the right to stay home and absolutely legitimately prepare Marines for battle, and he was desperate to get back into the fight.
Yeah,
And because that's
they sent him to DC to do a desk job and he hated it. They sent him on a bond tour and he was great at it, sold bonds and cavorted with movie stars, but deep down he wanted to go back. And he had a premonition that he was going to die, that he wasn't going to make it. And he, in fact, just days before heading out, he got married to Lena, and he told his brother and his sister, he goes, I'm going there, but I'm not coming back. And a lot of these guys, one of the themes that my brother and I have in our videos is there's so many, whether you're a person of faith or not, there were so many miracles in World War II, but there was also a lot of premonitions,
mm,
people knowing that something was going to happen to them. And, we tell a story about this guy named James Creamer, who was fighting in the Pacific, and his mom was getting surgery in Baltimore. She was having a mastectomy, which was rare back then. And he was fighting in battle, and they corresponded weekly through letters. And so at some point, his mother, who was during surgery, sort of stood up from her bed and screamed out, "Duck James." And her husband, who was tending to her, said, you know, what are you talking about? And she collapsed. 2 weeks later, they get a letter from James Creamer saying, like, the weirdest thing happened to me. I was in the jungle, and you know there's bullets all around us, and we were surrounded by the enemy, and out of nowhere I heard a voice, and it said duck, and I simply moved my head, and a bullet whizzed past me. And this has been chronicled. This isn't like urban legend. This is stuff where it's been chronicled and it's been well documented. And there's literally dozens of incidents like that, of just, you know, moments of faith or serendipity or whatever you want to call it, where there was a connection between these soldiers and people back home or loved ones. And those are the videos that resonate with people, because you know, they a lot of our viewers will relate that to something that happened in their own lives, and it's a way to, it's kind of a common language, this language of faith.
Yeah. Yeah, for real. There's so I don't know if you guys branch out, but I had an author on the show. He's a lawyer. He's Australian, and his dad's a very notable person. He was notable himself, but his uncle, and this man's an old man now. His name is Peter Dowding. He wrote a book about his uncle. His uncle went to Europe, as any Australian guy would want to do, to go, you know, cavort and learn and do all the things young people do. And he was there when World War II broke out for the Europeans, which obviously is before it happened for us. And so he sort of got trapped there. And once you're there, he's like, you know, well, I'm not leaving. And there's this beautiful girl. And so because of a girl and because of a war, he has this whole life. And essentially, if Peter doesn't tell his story, his uncle Bruce gets forgotten, but he's this fantastic hero who helps the resistance and, you know, can put himself out there in a way that other people couldn't, because he was from Australia, and he was the guy they would send on the road when they knew the pilots were coming inbound, who had gone down in planes. You write about this in your book, and we'll talk about your book in a second. But he could say, "Hi, good day on Bondi Beach," or something like that to the person walking the other direction. You're like, "Oh, that's the Australian guy," you know. And it was
Right.
It was obvious, right? So you have all of these stories. Do you guys tell the international side of this
Oh
as
yeah,
well?
absolutely. In fact, we tell a great story from World War I about the Aussies, the diggers as they were called. But there was a little boy, his name was John Birthday, and he was in France during World War I now, and his parents were killed. In fact, his whole family was wiped out, and he barely survived. And an Aussie regiment came upon him, and they sort of adopted him. They found him. He spoke no English, very little. All he could say was that, you know, his parents were dead, and he was alone, and he was about 8 years old. And so the group took him. They literally adopted the kid, and as they went and moved around and fought in Europe, the kid came with them. And at the end of the war, one of the soldiers, they didn't know what to do with them, and then one of the soldiers said, "Well, we're going to take him back to Australia." And it was actually illegal. You couldn't bring, others back home. But the guy risked jail time. He already had six
Yeah.
kids, and he brings them back to Australia. And John Birthday lived a productive life in Australia for 80 years. In fact, his nickname was Johnny the Frenchman. And their Aussies are some of the most gracious, extraordinary. Their story is amazing in World War I and World War II. Canadians too. We do a lot of international stories, actually. In fact, Scotty from Star Trek, who's Canadian, earned a Purple Heart during D-Day. He landed on Juno Beach, was shot up a bunch. An amazing guy. People don't realize that Scotty was a legit World War II hero. In fact, we do a lot of things on celebrities. Art Carney was at D-Day. Charles Bronson earned a Purple Heart. So many of these guys. Lee Marvin, a Marine, Purple Heart. James Garner. So many of the Hollywood era people that we looked up to. Tyrone Powers, Jimmy Stewart, one of the great airmen of all time. Clark Gable. These guys saw combat and performed amazingly, and at a different time when Hollywood was different than it is today.
Yeah. Yeah, it's the story of, and these are the people that stand out who didn't have to do these things. There's all kinds of stories about the filmmakers in general and how they served, and they, you know, made these great movies. There's documentaries about it. We are still telling this epic, and to the expense of probably Korea and World War One. We don't tell that story enough, but it's incredible. I mean, I'm going to put a link up right here, right now. This is that's the episode that I did with Peter Dowding writing about his uncle Bruce, and it's amazing that story. And likely nothing ever gets done on it because you can only make so many movies. and there are already so many movies about World War II.
Yeah, the
What
Korean
do
War
you?
gets
Yeah,
forgotten, though. You're right about that. Like the Korean
yeah,
War was every inch as brutal. I mean, the freezing conditions.
yeah,
It was not a glamorous war. If you remember, the Korean War, started in the early '50s. America had fatigue from World War II. We were just getting back into the swing of things. It's halfway around the world. Nobody really knows why we're fighting there,
yeah,
right? The North Koreans overrun it. It's part of the, kind of the early domino effect of communism and and um and the stories, we tell a couple stories from the Korean War. One about a guy named Matt Urban, who fought in World War II and was a hero, and then received the Medal of Honor in Korea as well. But like James Garner, a lot of celebrities fought in the Korean War as well, and they talk about the freezing cold and how brutal those conditions were. Obviously, the TV show MASH brought it to life a little bit, but Korea and Vietnam kind of get forgotten because they weren't, there was no conclusion to them. We didn't win them. It wasn't stuff that people came home that we weren't celebrating, particularly Vietnam vets, but even Korean War vets, and so we try to make sure that we're telling the stories, not just the greatest generation heroes, but people that fought in Korea, people that fought in Vietnam, and maybe have been forgotten about because those wars have been forgotten a little bit.
yeah, yeah. Basil Plumley is another guy who's great. He was represented in We Were Young Once, or We Were Soldiers,
Oh yeah, yeah, the
and
great
in that
movie.
movie. In the book is We Were Young Once and Soldiers, or something like that. Anyhow, he's played by Sam Elliott, and that
Right.
dude, that hard ass motherfucker,
Yeah.
jumped 5 times into combat zones. Five,
That
and
is
that's
that's amazing.
ridiculous. And that
One of
wasn't
our
in
most
Vietnam.
popular videos. I got to tell this story. So a
Yeah,
couple of our videos have done really, really well. We did one on Boss Hogg's Sorrel book. I mean,
yeah,
Boss Hogg. Everybody knows who Boss Hogg is, and
yeah,
it's gotten like 100,000 views. But we, my brother and I were doing research. I had no idea, and I'm a pretty big culture nerd. I had no idea that Sorrel Book was a bona fide genius. The guy graduated from Columbia College when he was 19,
yeah,
got a master's from Yale, spoke 12 languages, 12, six fluently, as he put it, six semi-fluently. And he also enlisted in the army during the Korean War and served as a counterintelligence officer, did interrogations, was a topography expert. I mean, here's a guy that's remembered for playing this kind of buffoonish cartoon character on the Dukes of Hazzard, and yet he was a brilliant linguist and a bona fide American hero who enlisted when he didn't have to enlist. He was already a budding stage actor, decides to enlist because he spoke Korean, Chinese, Japanese, a bunch of other languages, and did all this work that to this day is still classified, by the way. That's how confidential his work was. And like the average person has no idea. They think of Boss Hogg, from the TV show. And those stories. I mean, Dan Blocker from Bonanza. There's so many of those guys that we know them from different walks of life, from TV, from film, from movie, and they were genuine. Michael Caine, uh, legit Korean War hero. These guys, I just find that so remarkable because they never, these guys never went on TV. Sorrel Book never went on TV. Russell Johnson, Michael Caine, they never talked about their heroism or serving. When they did, they just said, I was there. They never preened about it. Ted Williams, the
yeah.
guy missed 5 years of his prime, World War II in Korea.
No,
Um,
no.
you know, Teaching in World War II, he didn't serve in combat, but he was an instructor in Pensacola, which I know is a naval
Yeah,
aviator. And then in Korea, he got called up and he flew like 39 missions, had a couple of close calls. I mean, this is at the height of his career. Nearly got shot down. His wingman was John Glenn, of all people. And John
yeah,
Glenn said Ted Williams was one of the most impressive aviators he had ever been around. And, you barely would know it from looking at Ted Williams' stats that he missed 5 years of the prime of his career and flew intense combat. And the guy
yeah.
never bragged about it.
Yeah, yeah. It's funny. There's a great book about him and John Glenn and being wingmen and everything. It's fantastic. I had the author of the book on. I'll put that up here in the books. But more importantly, I want you guys to go check out Nick's page. I'm going to put it in here on the. I actually have the link over here. Just give me a second, everybody. So if you go to this date on YouTube, you type in at this date, you'll see all just the litany of things. Boss Hogg's video, you'll see Russell from Gilligan's Island, all these great stories, and so there's all these famous people, but there's always these fantastic things, just all these wonderful things about the parachute. There's another one about maybe a belt or something. I can't. There's so many of them; it's hard to even keep track of all of them. You guys do a really good job with those things.
Yeah, you know what? A lot of the credit goes to my brother. He, I'm sort of the writer and historian. He's the content creator, and so he puts the visuals and the music together. And I think part of the reason why our channel resonates, it's only been around 18 months or so, and we have 270,000 subscribers on YouTube, another 300,000 on Facebook, and 50,000 on Instagram. Is that we tell stories? We're storytellers. You know, a lot of the stuff on YouTube, the short videos, they're like Wikipedia reads. They use an AI voice and it's
Mm,
Wikipedia, and it's not all that interesting. And we
right,
try to zero in on what's a 59-second short movie look like. And we don't view our
right.
shorts as shorts. We view them as 59-second movies. And on our Instagram page, for instance, we have probably 3 or 4 dozen celebrities. Billy Baldwin's a big fan of our page. So many celebrities that follow our stuff because we tell these kind of 59-second movies about people
Hmm.
that Chris Christopherson or Johnny Cash served in the Korean War, and people you never heard of. So many nurses that were just heroic, but they're 59-second movies with, I like to say, a beginning, a middle, and an end with the great music bed underneath it and great visuals. And I feel like that's why it's connecting with people is they want stories. They don't want, anybody could do a Wikipedia video and just list out somebody's accomplishments, but can you tell a story in 59 seconds and hold their attention and bring it to a crescendo and have some type of emotional payoff? And if anybody's been on our channel and you go through our videos in the comment section, there are so many tear emojis. We get people, they
Mm,
cry at the end of these things because we're trying to tell a very human, very personal, very intimate story in 59 seconds. And that's
yeah.
kind of really fun.
It is fun, and one of the things everybody should do is look in the community tab on your guys' YouTube channel because it's just rich with all these things. And so there's a couple things that stand out. So my grandfather Don, he lived in Inglewood during this is LA area, and
Right.
so during that time, and they played Beverly Hills High, and when he was at Inglewood High, Betty White was at
Oh my
Beverly Hills
God.
High. Yeah, and
You
so
know the
those were
story of
two.
Betty White. She drove a
Yeah,
truck
well, that's
during
why
the
I'm mentioning this. Yeah, go ahead.
No, no. Betty White. So two of the four Golden Girls, Betty White and B. Arthur, drove trucks during World War II. One for the Army and one for the Marines. B. Arthur was a Marine. Betty White
Yeah.
was actually a budding model. She had a good career already going on in the early 40s. She was a model. She wasn't on TV yet or in film, but was earning good money as a model. After Pearl Harbor, they had the sort of the women's auxiliary. The Army did where they gave them jobs that they didn't have to give to men so that the men could go overseas. And so for 4 years, during the entire duration of the war, she drove trucks up and down California, which I could see that. She has kind of a salty personality. And B. Arthur did the same thing in North Carolina. She joined the Marines. And like, what are the odds that two of the four Golden Girls would be not just like legit
Yeah.
participants in the war, but drove trucks, which I think
Right.
is completely badass. And I just love that again, you would never know from watching the Golden Girls. I didn't know this until we had this channel that B. Arthur and Betty White. And B. Arthur, she was on Maude and All in the Family, and it was kind of a well-known liberal, I think, politically, but yet she was a Marine. And
Yeah.
in one of the quotes she had, and it was towards the end of her life, she said something to the effect of "Once a Marine, always a Marine," and they all say that. Lee Marvin, the only on his headstone, I think, says that he was a Marine. Charles
Sure.
Bronson, all these guys on their headstones or on their epitaphs, it talks about their service, not about their movie career or
Yeah.
Hollywood or being a celebrity. So many of them, um, you know, towards the end of their life, started reflecting on their service during World War II, which I find really cool.
Yeah, it's really neat. And the that note where Lee Marvin, it's like, oh, this guy is a great actor and he does his, he's plays these kind of rough and tumble guys, but also don't fuck with him
Don't
because he's
fuck with them.
actually a legit dude, a
Legit
legit hard ass.
badass. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So
I was talking to a movie producer friend of mine because I said, it's interesting which stars, not guys, which stars really resonate with people and which ones come and go. Like a guy like Charles Bronson, we did a video on him. We did a bunch, and they go through the roof. And I didn't know that until we started doing these videos, and it dawned on me the reason why he resonates with so many moviegoers from the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s is that he played the person he really was. I mean,
Mm,
he was a legit
mhm.
badass. He was a badass during World War II. Like I said, Purple Heart, nearly died. Same with Lee Marvin. Same with so many of these guys. They were legit badasses, and that's
Right.
not something you could fake. You could try to act like one today, and people see
Yeah.
through it. But their staying pat, or even after they're long gone, Neville Brand, another guy who played Duke on Stalag 17 on so many great shows.
Sure.
All these guys that played these tough guys on TV were legitimate heroes and tough guys in real life. There was no preening, there was no faking. You know, Steve
Yeah.
McQueen, he didn't fight more, but he was a Marine. He saved 5 Marines' lives. James Garner, Purple Heart recipient from Korean War, and it's so interesting to me that you'll never see that again, right? You're not going to see,
No. Yeah.
guys from Hollywood enlisting to go serve. It's just not going to happen.
Yeah. Well, even like Rob Riggle's a colonel, or
Yeah,
was a
yeah,
colonel in the Marines, but he didn't, and he admits he's like, no, I didn't go anywhere. I mean, I was here and I was a comedian, right? So, but there was this mass of humanity that moved out for World War I, World War II, and the stories connect like crazy. You're talking about the saturation of the Golden Girls having, done service. So I've been talking about my grandpa Don, but my grandpa Arthur, also like he worked on an oiler and went out and serviced all the ships out there. And his brother was a guy doing something. I forget. I think he was like in Hawaii doing it. So all of these guys, they all left, and whole industries, whole parts of the nation moved to California, to the Bay Area to build ships, and they moved to. And people don't realize this. I've learned this through my research about my grandfather. Illinois received all of the stuff from the upper Midwest. They built Higgins ships up there, and then they floated them down. And this is a crazy thing. One of the main places, if not the main place, to learn how to land on an aircraft carrier was done in the Great Lakes, right outside of Chicago,
oh,
right
interesting.
there
Yeah,
on. Yeah, and so the entire nation had ties to this stuff, where everybody knew somebody who either passed or was doing things. It was there, but also it's a narrow slice. Like my grandfather gets into the combat side of things in the Pacific with the Marines just at the very tail end of the war. So much so that, and he would never know this, but the big machine had slowed down how many pilots are coming through. These trainers, you mentioned Ted Williams earlier, these trainers that were working, 7 days a week trying to
right.
get pilots out, now like, hey, you can take Sundays off. We'll just call it a weather day or
Your
whatever.
grandfather
And they
might have
started to
come
back
across
off.
Teddy Ballgame in Pensacola if he was down there in
You know,
'45.
my he might have, and my so and like I think I was looking on your thing. Bill and Francine are also like they're my grandparents, right? So Bill and Francine are in the community notes for you guys
Yep.
on their channel, and it's just this veteran and his gorgeous wife, right? He was a football captain, hero guy, and then
She
his
was a
girlfriend
cheerleader.
was cheerleader. That's
So many of
exactly
those
my
stories.
grandfather.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's
and that's my
everybody's
grandfather and
story.
my grandmother. Same
Yeah,
thing.
we found so many of those stories, and they're poignant. They're not, these aren't John Bass alone. These aren't heroes. It's just a
Yeah,
picture of a guy and his girl, but that's like everybody's story. And they knew each other from third grade, or they met at a USO dance, or
yeah,
we tell a story about a couple that met one USO dance 2 days before he shipped out, and they wrote each other all during the war. He kept his picture on, her picture on him. And when he came back, she was waiting in the Chicago train station. And 70 years later, and 15 great grand, like that's America. I mean, I love those
yeah.
stories more than anything else because
Oh,
they're everybody's story. That was America back then. Like, and I
yeah,
just love that. And it's so, we can't tell enough of those. Every time we do one of those videos or tell one of those stories in the community notes, we get flooded with people with sending pictures because people always say, "Where do you do all the research?" And I'm like, after a while, the research comes to us. People
sure.
start telling us and sharing with us and telling our story, and that's part of the reason why we my brother and I wrote a book, here called "That's How It Goes," and it's a novel. I've written a bunch of history books on the presidency, and as we were doing this channel, so many people kept saying like, "Hey, you need to write a movie or connect these stories together." And finally, we said, "Yeah, we should do that." And we wrote a book, and it's really based on an amalgamation of all the characters that we've come across in these amazing story arcs. If you go to Amazon, just type in Nick Ragone, you'll see it. But it's called "That's How It Goes." The title comes from a Sinatra song, which he sang one time on radio, which I absolutely love. But it tells the story of three students and a substitute teacher, and how their narratives kind of intertwine throughout the war. And
Mm.
it's doing really well on Amazon. It was ranked number 400 in historical fiction. And we get so many emails from people saying like, I know these characters. I feel like I grew up with them. The way you tell their stories, because that was my grandfather, or that was my uncle, or that was the
Right.
guy at the VFW that I used to talk to. Like, how did you know their story? And I'm like, because it was everybody's story.
It was everybody's story. Yeah, my grandfather gets to be a pilot partly because he just had started college, but also was the kind of athlete they wanted to put in airplanes. This is a physical endeavor, and he wasn't, as far as I can tell. And I've not completed all the research, but I've been over the basics. So it would, I don't know how to time to Ted Williams, and maybe they don't weren't there at the same time, but he for sure in his flight log was check writing with Scott Crossfield. And Scott Crossfield's among the most famous pilots from the 20th century, and this is a guy who was out there just so they're all going through these same areas. Oh, by the way, my grandfather, Marine pilot, Ed McMahon is also a Marine pilot,
Yep,
and
yeah, Ed McMahon. That's right. Bob
yeah, so they
Barker,
live in
so
the
many of
same
them.
area. They absolutely, they were both reservists. They absolutely are all going out on flight day. And so my dad's like, or my grandfather's like, yeah, there's Ed McMahon. It's not, but he's not Ed McMahon there. He's just, Colonel McMahon or whatever, right?
Right, right,
And so,
right.
these guys, it was a very huge world, and yet it was a very small world, the way it was interwoven in all of these repeated things, because that was the culture of that time.
Yeah, Jerry Coleman, the second baseman for the Yankees, he was Rookie of the Year, won five World Series rings.
Hmm.
He's the only person, believe it or not, people think it's Ted Williams. He was the only person to fight in both World War II and Korea. He was an aviator in World War II, flew like 45 missions in the Pacific, did the
That's
same in
right.
Korea. Williams wasn't actually in combat in World War II, and then became a Hall of Fame broadcaster for the Padres. Flew
Right.
something like 90 combat missions between World War II and Korea, which
Yeah.
is as much as almost anybody.
Yeah.
Just an amazing guy. I should say, the only baseball player, not the only person, the only baseball player to fight in World War II and Korea was actually Jerry Coleman, and
Yeah.
just an amazing individual. And won five World Series with the vaunted Yankee teams, Hall of Fame broadcaster, and fought in two wars. And you would never have known that. Like, most people have no idea who Jerry Coleman is.
Sure. No, they don't remember. And also, let's not walk past Bob Feller, who
Bob
served
Feller.
in
Wow.
both theaters during World War II. So he did
USS
Euro Theater and
Alabama.
Pac Theater. Yeah.
You want to know the best Bob Feller story? If you want to know how tough and how much of a badass that guy was, and if you're a baseball fan, compare it to today, when if you throw 5 innings, it's like hallelujah. The guy, he was a dominant pitcher. In fact, he was so dominant. He was driving on December 7th. He was driving to Chicago from Iowa, where he lived, to renegotiate his contract with the GM of the Indians. They were meeting at the baseball meetings, the winter meetings in Chicago. Feller had come off a 20-plus win season, was the
Wow.
dominant pitcher. I mean, he led the league in strikeouts and wins. It was like third in ERA. And so he's going to renegotiate his contract. Here's on the radio, and he had one of the few cars. He had like a Cadillac that had a radio, that Pearl Harbor happened. Turns around, goes back to Iowa, enlists in the Navy without telling the GM or anybody. Serves on the U.S. Alabama. He gets gets out of the Navy on August 11th. By August 14th, he's making a start for the Indians. Okay, no, he didn't go to the minor leagues. He didn't have any bullpen sessions. He starts for the Indians. He throws 13 innings against the first place Tigers and wins the game with 12 strikeouts. Like, who does that? I mean,
I
talk
don't know.
about just a total badass. And now today, if you throw 5 innings, it's a miracle. This guy stepped off a boat, and 3 innings later, whiffs 13 guys.
Yeah. It's crazy, the way that the athletes just bounce back. Ted Williams easily could have died a couple different ways, right? And but
Oh,
and
he had a
and one of the
crash landing.
times,
Ted Williams had
yeah,
had nearly it wasn't a belly landing, but it was close to being a belly landing in Korea.
yeah, yeah. One of the times he flew so close that because John Glenn, here's the thing: is John Glenn's a psychopath. He's like, I'm going to go out and do my mission. Well, I'm going to double back and get me just a little bit more. So he was known for getting low and getting fast, and he was like this miracle of a pilot. And so he'd come back and just get after it one more time. And everybody's like, you did the job, get home. And he's like, nah, I'm going to go get some more ass. I'm going to get. And so Ted would follow him, because these guys are together and everything.
Yeah,
And one of
yeah.
the times they were so low to the ground. a piece of earth got kicked up, and that causes these huge damage to Ted's plane. It
Right.
damn near kills him.
Well,
It's
yeah,
crazy.
I think that story is related to he lost
Yeah,
the engine and had to make a kind of crash landing. And the fact that
yeah,
John Glenn said that Williams was one of the best pilots he ever flown with, and there's something about it because Ted Williams famously had 2010 vision. He could kind of,
yeah.
he could see the seams of a ball that was coming at him. And I remember the story was when he was at flight school in Pensacola during World War II, his reflexes, they tested reflexes back then, and on the Marine test that they did for aviator or the Navy aviators, he scored the highest ever on this
Wow.
reflex test, which is just just amazing. I mean,
Yeah.
arguably would have had every single baseball hitting record till the end of time if he didn't miss those 5 years. I mean, truly
Oh
just
yeah.
amazing man.
Yeah, it's an incredible thing. Well, so you'll appreciate this. Again, I'm just going to my grandfather. He said I've just learned so much about it, but he was going through his aircraft landing, and it's just in and out real fast. Like you already know how to fly, you've already gone through advanced school, and for people who don't know, you start this process off months and months before by just like going out and unchalking your plane out, and he did it in Wilcox, Arizona. So that's they called not pre-flight because pre-flight was something else, but it was like early flight school, and then you go to pre-flight, and then you go to basic, then you go to advanced, and you go to combat maneuvers, and then you go learn how to land on an aircraft carrier. And so he is doing that, and then and he's writing letters the entire time. I got the pile of them here, and so as he's moving through, he is going through Chicago's Union Station, their big gigantic station, and on basically Christmas Eve to get back to where he's got to get to so he can go to San Diego and deploy. Well, that Christmas season, Norman Rockwell painted that for the Saturday Evening Post, painted Union Station all decorated for Christmas. And so my dad is walking through a Norman Rockwell painting in real life. You think about like all these people that go through there, and it's just amazing. So you can look at the Saturday Evening Post cover from that session, and he's walking by looking at the newsstand because, of course, you do that because you're like, I'm going to be sitting on this train for a couple hours. Let me get something to read. And he's looking at a painting of the world he's walking through. And by the way, the station, when Norman and the station were partnering on, he's like, I'm going to paint this thing. And they're like, okay, well, we'll decorate it however you paint the Christmas decorations. And he's like, no, you tell me what you guys are going to do, and I'll just do. And they're like, no. So Norman Rockwell actually designs the Christmas decorations at Union Station for that year when the Battle of the Bulge is happening. So all of these things kind of mixed together, and there was my grandfather walking through this moment of history, right?
Isn't that cool?
Yeah, and it's not just him; it's all of these people. But there are so many of these instances where everybody, even Norman Rockwell, is celebrating and pushing and doing what he can, and he's he's just some goofy painter somewhere, right? But he's actually a piece of important Americana.
Yeah, it's funny. It reminds you of a story of Rosie the Riveter. There was actually, and I'm
Mm-hmm.
blanking her name. We did a video on it. A woman who was in a factory in Los Angeles, and her picture was taken, and she didn't really know that it was used to model the Westinghouse poster, which was "We Can Do It with the
Wow.
Arm," which is really the Rosie the Riveter, not the song. And she didn't find out till 50 years later. She was going through a Rosie the Riveter museum, and she saw that Westinghouse painting and was like, "Oh my God, that was modeled on me." And sure enough, and they went back to the archives and they found the picture that the artist based it on. And it's all these little touch points. So, I mean, that Rosie the Riveter to me is one of the great, that poster, the "We Can Do It" poster, is one of the great iconic moments from World War II. And it's just somebody who was in a factory wearing a red polka dot bandana and in overalls, and had a, sort of a look that they were looking for. And her picture was snapped up. And that's now a piece of American history.
Yeah,
And, she didn't get a dime from it, and she didn't get any notoriety. But
yeah.
as American as anything from World War II.
As American as anything from now. I mean, how many
Yeah.
women have that spirit in them? What an amazing piece of propaganda, and what an amazing spirit. All these women are ready to do things, and I think really truly that Rosie the Riveter moment is something that launches the U.S. forward. Women do have value besides just making babies and being at the house, and there's nothing wrong with taking care of a house and running a family. That's fantastic. But also, man, you know what? You can go be a CEO. You can be an entrepreneurial startup founder who goes out and starts world class companies, and that all goes back to Rosie the Riveter. And I'll even say this: women come to our country because of that opportunity. Because in, we'll just say Brazil or wherever else, they're not taken seriously. They're like, oh yeah, you're the pretty one. Where's the actual person? It's like, no, motherfucker, I am the person. And that,
Right,
all of
right.
that goes back to that moment for sure.
There are so many, it reminds me of so many of the nurse stories that get forgotten. We do a lot of videos on nurses because they were as badass as anybody. They
Yeah.
flew into combat towards the end. The air evac nurses were flown into. In fact, there's one, a nurse, Ensign Jane Kendall, in the Navy. She was the first combat nurse, and she landed at Iwo Jima on D-Day +1, and started caring for the wounded Marines. They had one of the largest evacuations ever of wounded at Iwo Jima of sailors and Marines. And she tells the story that, she did her thing and, was nursing guys. And when she went back stateside to do a bomb tour, they said, how did the Marines react when they saw you on a combat field? And she paused for a second and she said, they reacted like they did everywhere else. They whistled, which I
Mm,
just love. It's the Marines are half a planet away, and a nurse comes on there, and of course they'd whistle. She was a beautiful nurse, but back then you could do that, and and these nurses, so many stories about them caring for their boys and how they risked their lives to take care of their boys and bring their boys back home, and it was very personal for them, and I just love those stories. They're my favorite videos.
yeah. Yeah, my cat's trying to jump up on the printer, and she's not sure what to do about it. So she might jump into my lap here in a second.
No, that's okay.
Um, the the stories you guys get, and you said a lot of them just show up, and I'm giving you stuff about my grandfather, and heck, I didn't talk about his brother. His brother is just a shade older than him, and he gets picked up to be a pilot. And what does he fly? He flies B-17s, in Europe.
Wow.
And one of the crazy things
Most
about all
dangerous
this
job
stuff,
you could have, by the way, in the European theater, the kill rate among bomber crews, particularly B-17s, was like in the
insane.
20%. So if you
Yeah.
did if you flew your mandatory 25 missions, you were statistically dead 5 times.
Yeah, it's crazy how dangerous that was and how essential they were. I
Essential.
had this great. My show gives me so many gifts, and I want you to talk about the gifts that your show gives you too, because you do touch lives. But Peter Dowding comes to me and says, "Hey, I'd like to be in your show. I've written this book about my brother Bruce, right, or Uncle Bruce, and you guys should all get this book. It's fantastic. I'll put a link up for it in a minute." But also, he found me because I had on these two different historians from England, and one is named Gills and one is named Halleck. And I had Halleck on first because she wrote about all the resistances and just kind of said, these are all the resistances. This is what they basically all did. And then Gills, he wrote about basically Churchill's madmen who invented these crazy bombs and weapons of war that were like literally like Alka-Seltzer tablets, condoms, and candy. Where like all these things work together to make this submersible bomb. Like amazing, right? And so these things go together because these operators would jump in with these crazy bombs, and they would be received by the resistance, and they would do the thing that they did, right? And so as we're flying all these planes overhead trying to take out industrial capacity, you also have these surgical strikes that often, when successful, let's say that just outside of Hamlet B, there's a factory, and so somebody from England jumps in with these crazy bombs, and they wacko that place, and it's no longer around. So the Germans turn around and go back to Village B, but who did it? Because they know someone there was connected to it, and they're like, we're going to kill people until someone tells us. And so they wipe out the entire village, all to
Wow.
make capacity stop. So not only those pilots, but all those people, all those villages, all those communities on the ground, where they're just erased, or half of them are killed because the Germans had to stop this attrition on them as well. I mean, it's just, the war had that brutality. And you think, gosh, do you really want to put people in that position? And the answer was yes, because to win this war, that's what it took.
It did have brutality and also had moments of graciousness. It reminds me of the story of the bomber pilot Charlie Brown, an American, and the World War II ace Franz Stigler, and they had just finished a bombing run, I think over Dresden actually, and this guy Charlie Brown, his B-17, they were crippled. They were limping back home. They fell out of formation. They were listing. It was clear, that they were not going to make it. And this the World War II ace, this German Stigler, flew up to it, and he sort of looked inside it and saw a couple guys dead. They saw it on flames, and then he caught eyes with Charlie Brown, the pilot, an American, the B-17, and he kind of looked at him and he sort of nodded to him, and he didn't flame him. He could have flamed him right there, and instead he rode by his side and kind of escorted him out of German airspace to the English Channel. And it's an amazing story of grace. It's a real story. It's been well
Yeah.
chronicled, and they ended up meeting each other, Charlie Brown and Franz Stigler, years and years later, like 60 years later, and
And there's
became
so
friends
many of those great
actually.
stories.
Yeah, there's just so many
Yeah.
of those. There's a lot of none of them in Japan and the Pacific Theater. You never hear those stories of grace and mercy, but there were a lot of them during the European theater of war, where there was moments of grace at the most inopportune, unexpected time. Which we've done a bunch of those videos, and they do
Oh,
really, really well.
yeah. And I've had a lot of World War II. As I'm thinking about this, I'm like, oh my gosh, I've actually covered this quite a bit. But I had an author on my show, and he wrote a book about the first guy to fly into Pearl Harbor from the Japanese side.
Oh, really?
And yeah, and so he comes in, does his job, survives the war and everything. He moves to America and becomes an American.
It's amazing. Yeah, right.
It's
It's amazing. He moved to
it's
America.
amazing.
Yeah, we did a video of a
Yeah.
guy, a Japanese pilot who, so he actually dropped an incendiary bomb over Washington State. People don't realize this really happened. It wasn't an air balloon. They had a guy, and it was based off a submarine. I don't know how, but it was a sub that had a plane on it, and this guy flew not one but two missions over Washington State, dropped incendiary bombs, hoping to set the West on fire. It didn't do anything. But 20 years later, he came back to that town in Washington and gave the town people his family's samurai sword, and donated money to the library, and every year would come visit this city in Washington until
That's
he
crazy.
died, and had this connection. And it's such an amazing story. This guy dropped two bombs on U.S. soil. People don't realize two bombs were dropped on U.S. soil, and then was forever linked to this town and had a connection to it.
How does that happen? How does someone go from, that? You could easily be like, I'm one of the guys who bombed the United States, but then to go back and just have this debt that they feel is unpayable, so he spends his life trying to pay it back and make amends. How does this happen?
That's a great question. And this guy specifically, he felt guilty. I think it happens because a lot of them, both in Japan and Germany here, they didn't want to. I mean, they were drafted. They weren't, they fought an enemy they didn't know for political reasons they didn't understand. Particularly in
Mm,
Germany, a lot of those most of those Germans weren't Nazis. They were just Germans that were conscripted into the army. And same with the Japanese. They weren't fanatical, but yet they got caught up in something. And so, on the rare instance when there was these moments of mercy, I think it was just one human being relating to another, at a very human level. We did a video on Christmas 1944 in the Hurricane Forest. And this is a true story. Hallmark did a movie on it. It was on Unsolved Mysteries. It's been very well chronicled, but uh, there was a mother and her 11-year-old son making Christmas dinner, deep in the Hurricane Forest, which was brutal and cold and isolated. And they get a knock on the door, and it's three American soldiers who are lost. And they come upon this little shack, and the mother lets them in and says, "Okay, leave your guns outside, but you could come in and we'll feed you." And about an hour later, they hear a knock on the door again. It's three German soldiers who are also lost. And she would have been killed had they, because you couldn't house American soldiers. But she said to the guys, "Look, leave your guns in here, come in, but just know that there's three Americans here." And the Germans went in and they celebrated Christmas dinner, and they stayed all night. The Americans slept on the floor next to the Germans. And the next morning, one of the Germans said to the Americans, he said, "Take my compass to find your way back to your men." And he said, "Don't go through this town. We took it back last night. You'll get killed. Go this route." And so the German gave them a compass and a map to escape back to their side. And 40 years later, the son of the wife met up with some of the American soldiers, and they sort of reminisced about that. And I just find that's one of my favorite stories of, again, finding grace and mercy at the most unlikeliest of times.
yeah. Here's the I had T. Martin Bennett on the show, and actually I had him on the show, and also brought in one of the Indy survivors' sons. And so that Indy survivor, he had gone to the stabilization force that went to Japan post-war, fell in love with a Japanese girl, brought her back, and then had this kid. And so you have this legacy of these, this horrible war. We dropped atomic bombs on these people, and still
Right.
love prevails. And
I
his
was in
dad wasn't crazy
Hiroshima.
about yeah,
I was in Japan this summer, and we were in Tokyo, and we went to Osaka, Kyoto, and then we made a stop to Hiroshima because I had to see it for myself. And um, it's an amazing. It's first of all, it's an amazing country, Japan, but Hiroshima is particularly. I mean, you feel the when you're there, you kind of just feel the weightiness of it, like you're in a different place, and you could see the actual spot where the bomb exploded overhead, and all the things that you think you'd see. But what's amazing, what's sort of interesting, is that there's no context. If you go through the Hiroshima Museum, there's no context for the war over there. They don't teach it. They famously don't teach World War II. And so as an American, it's a bit jarring because you go to Hiroshima and you walk around and you kind of see like living artifacts of where, shaded out people on the sidewalks, and you see, half crumbled buildings still around, and you see all this stuff, and it's moving and poignant, and you feel something. But then if you go through the museum, or even if you talk to people, they have no context of like what happened before the dropping of the bomb, what happened during the war. Why did we drop the bomb? Why did we have to drop two bombs, right? Because one wasn't enough. And
yeah,
there's none of that context. And it's a little weird because as Americans, we obviously know full well what led up to, you know, 4 years of fighting in World War II, and why we had to drop two bombs, and what would have happened if we didn't drop the bomb, and a land invasion would have been disastrous. But over
yeah,
there, there's none of that context. And so you kind of get the sense that this bomb was dropped. And I just, as an American student, I found that a little bit jarring.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, it's well, the whole thing is jarring, and we're just talking about the Japanese and American and a couple of British things. You think about all of the different areas, Germany itself and everything. It's crazy. All of the books and the stories that come out of this, and you guys have managed to find yourself a wonderful little niche. I mean,
Thank
you
you.
see these photos of these couples or these nurses, and they speak to you, and you want to hear what they have to say. And I'm like clicking the link. I'm like, but where's the story about this person? And it's just got to be a great ride for you and your brother. Your brother chimed in a second ago. Great to see
Yeah.
him on there.
Yeah.
Um,
He's the creative genius behind it.
you can do bios and vignettes until you guys die and not run out of material because there's
We'll
just
never
so
run
much
out
of
of
it.
material. There's, like
I
I
went to
said,
the
50.
World War One museum, and I asked one of the archivists there, and I'm like, you guys only show a fraction of what you have. How many movies are just sitting back in the archive? She's like, uncountable,
Yeah.
uncountable. She's like, there's people that fell in love from opposite sides of the world and wrote love letters to each other, having barely ever, And you talked about one of these stories too, where you have this brief encounter and then a 70-year relationship. That's so common in all these things, and all you have to do is start putting the pieces together. And the story of Don Norton and Ed McMahon. If I can ever actually connect them on the same flight log on the same day, that's just that much more richness in all of these things. So I'm excited for you guys. I'm excited for your success.
No,
I'm
I
excited for your show.
appreciate you reaching out. This has been great to talk about it, and we're going to continue. Like you said, there 15 million people touched World War II, Americans, and so in my mind, that's 15 million stories. That's a lot of stories.
Yeah. Yeah. Here's the link, by the way. And we try to promote these things. So here's the link for Nick's book, and I guess the thing you guys know I always say is buy it too. It's clever. It's written almost like a screenplay. It's not in the hard format of a screenplay, but it's very conversational and filled with images. And I found it just a quick, easy read. And I like it. What's next for you guys? You're already creating this content. The channel seems to be doing great. That means there's a little bit of money coming in and all that kind of stuff. And that makes you want to do more. So what do you think you guys are going to do next?
A couple things, and thank you for that question. We want to get into long format documentaries. In fact, we're putting the final touches on one called Baseball at War, which we think is going to
Mm,
be fascinating. It tells the stories of the Bob Fellers and Hank Greenbergs and Ted Williams and
yeah.
Jerry Coleman's. And so we want to get into more long format storytelling. Eventually, we want to get into a little bit of podcasting. We have so many of these interesting stories that don't
Sure.
quite fit into a vignette, but we want to talk about them. And then working on another book. It's actually one of the characters in That's How It Goes, the nurse Grace Drury. We get so many people interested in like just more about her, and so I'm
Sure.
going to work. We're going to write some type of book on her and really getting into what nurses, what they went up against during World War II. I just think it's so interesting and so fascinating. So we want to, we have a lot more content we want to explore in the next couple of years.
This is the same kind of thing. This guy Eric Vickery wrote this great book about baseball. It's called "The Season of Shattered Dreams." Everybody, and he
Wow.
did a show with me recently. And it's post-war, right? And so he says that he means literally these are guys who are like, I'm going to become a ball player, and either they're too young to go to war, or they have all these hardened veterans that are coming through, and these guys are trying to play. They're playing low, 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 like D ball, A ball kind of thing, and you know a tragedy ensues. The bus goes off the side of a mountain, and it's the worst sporting transit accident in
Wow.
the nation's history, right? But this is full of veterans who are like, okay, now I can get back to my life. It's 1946 or whatever year this whole thing happens, and they're trying to go forward to see if they've got a shot or see what they're going to be. And even that's a World War II story, right? Because these
Yeah.
guys, their lives were changed forever by this thing. It's amazing. And so I love seeing you guys dig in and look and see where these stories are. We definitely could tell more of these nurse stories because these women are incredible. I mean, the first
They really
combat
are.
nurses, what you write about it in your book about the lady who's like, I'm a substitute teacher, and now I'm going to go be a
Yeah.
flight nurse, which hadn't even been invented yet and how to do
Isn't
it.
that amazing? It's just so badass. Like I'm a substitute teacher. I took one class on CPR as a swim instructor, and now I'm going to go be a flight nurse. And by the way,
Yeah,
flight nurses, they had to care for the wounded at 10,000 feet under duress, being attacked in choppy air. I mean, I don't even like flying now. They were
yeah,
so badass, and
yeah,
they were so good at their job. Had so many stories, and there's one story we tell. I don't know if I put this with the character in the book, but it's real, based on a nurse, a nurse named Grace Chicken, great name. And as she was taking care of people, she would, if they were, a lot of them would, she'd sing to them because were delirious. She'd hold their
yeah,
hand during the whole flight.
yeah,
Oh, and if they died, she would really try to study their face and remember them, because some of them died in transit, and she felt like I had to remember their faces to keep them alive, which I just find so heartbreaking. And these nurses are
yeah.
truly unsung heroes.
I one time, so I used to go to combat a lot. I was a spy, and I would fly home. And one of the flights, 'cause you're trying to get in the first thing smoking, get me out of here. And they're like, they're like the military is adorable. They're like, there'll be human remains on this flight. Are you guys okay with that? Like, get me fucking home.
Right, right.
So I took this medevac bird back, and because it was the next thing going, I'm like, I'll sit on that thing. And let me tell you something. Anybody listening, if you it is, first off, it's a hospital, but it's a hospital with people that have been shot the fuck up, and so there's blood smells and rotting smells, and it's horrible. And you're seeing these dudes laying there in like a picture, what should be, a bunch of people going home. It's all these gurneys with all these, bottles and bubbles and machines and all this stuff keeping these guys alive. And when you go over turbulence and that kind of thing, it's not good for those guys. They groan, and so
Man.
you are in it. And that's what these ladies did. But my job's, I said my job because you guys understand my job's crazy. It's dangerous. It's hard. It breaks your brain. That shit was hard. I was up there. I'm like, you guys do this every day? You're flying back and forth with all these guys. You're caring for them. Oh my God. And it's just, you look at the hardest version of that, which would have been 70 years earlier, or 60 or whatever it was at the time. It's amazing that they did that because it was not a gentle thing. And that
No.
that one flight left marks on me and gave me a lot of respect for what it means to be wounded and have someone there caring for you and rubbing your cheek, because your cheek is the one place where you're not torn up, just saying
Wow.
you're going to be okay. That little bit of encouragement gets you through that long, hard flight, because we'll make that flight if we believe in it, and that's part of their job, is to get us to believe in that flight and getting home and getting better.
That's amazing, man. That's amazing.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Anything you want to say in closing before we wrap this thing up? Really
No,
fantastic
just
episode. I'm really
thank
excited about
you. You go to thisdate.com if you want to look at our book, or go to YouTube and just type in at this date. And appreciate your reaching out. And we love telling these stories, and we're going to keep telling them.
Yeah, I'm going to put the link for thisdate.com in the machine here, and you guys will have a chance to push on that button. I'm going to roll these credits. Stay with me real quick, and I'll be right back to you. Everybody else, have a good night. Hey, thanks for watching the show. I really appreciate it. Right here, you can subscribe. Please do that. It makes the show grow. Hit that notification bell so you know which incredible guest is coming up next. Down below is the PayPal link. You can put a small subscription in. That is an enormous help. All that money goes right back into the show. And then right up over here are the next episodes you should listen to, curated by yours truly. Thank you so much.